Section 2 of Curiosities of Literature, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Curiosities of Literature, Volume 1 by Isaac Disraeli, on the life and writings of Mr. Disraeli, Part 2. There appeared about this time a satire on the abuse of satire. The verses were polished and pointed, a happy echo of that style of Mr. Pope, which still lingered in the spellbound ear of the public. Peculiarly, they offered a contrast to the irregular effusions of the popular assailant, whom they in turn assailed, for the object of their indignant invective was the bard of the Lusiad. The poem was anonymous, and was addressed to Dr. Warton in lines of even classic grace. Its publication was appropriate. There are moments when every one is inclined to praise, especially when the praise of a new pen may at the same time revenge the insults of an old one. But if there could be any doubt of the success of this new hand, it was quickly removed by the conduct of Peter Pindar himself. As is not unusual with persons of his habits, Walcott was extremely sensitive, and brandishing a tomahawk, always himself shrank from a scratch. This was shown some years afterwards by his violent assault on Mr. Gifford with a bludgeon in a bookseller's shop, because the author of the Baviad and Maiviad had presumed to castigate the great lampooner of the age. In the present instance, the furious Walcott leaped to the rash conclusion that the author of the satire was no less a personage than Mr. Hayley, and he assailed the elegant author of the Triumphs of Temper in a virulent pasquinade. This ill-considered movement of his adversary, of course, achieved the complete success of the anonymous writer. My father, who came up to town to read the newspapers at the St. James's Coffee House, found their columns filled with extracts from the fortunate effusion of the hour, conjectures as to its writer, and much gossip respecting Walcott and Hayley. He returned to Enfield laden with the journals, and presenting them to his parents, broke to them the intelligence that at length he was not only an author, but a successful one. He was indebted to this slight effort for something almost as agreeable as the public recognition of his ability, and that was the acquaintance, and almost immediately the warm personal friendship of Mr. Pye. Mr. Pye was the head of an ancient English family that figured in the parliaments and struggles of the Stuarts. He was member for the county of Berkshire, where his ancestral seat of Faringdon was situate, and at a later period, 1790, became poet laureate. In those days, when literary clubs did not exist, and when even political ones were extremely limited and exclusive in their character, the booksellers' shops were social rendezvous. Debrett's was the chief haunt of the Whigs, Hatchard's, I believe, of the Tories. It was at the latter house that my father made the acquaintance of Mr. Pye, then publishing his translation of Aristotle's Poetics, and so strong was party feeling at that period, that one day, walking together down Piccadilly, Mr. Pye, stopping at the door of Debrett, requested his companion to go in and purchase a particular pamphlet for him, adding that if he had the audacity to enter, more than one person would tread upon his toes. My father at last had a friend. Mr. Pye, though double his age, was still a young man, and the literary sympathy between them was complete. Unfortunately, the member for Berkshire was a man rather of an elegant turn of mind than one of that energy and vigour which a youth required for a companion at that moment. Their tastes and pursuits were perhaps a little too similar. They addressed poetical epistles to each other, and were reciprocally too gentle critics. But Mr. Pye was a most amiable and accomplished man, a fine classical scholar, and a master of correct versification. He paid a visit to Enfield, and by his influence hastened a conclusion at which my grandfather was just arriving, to wit, that he would no longer persist in the fruitless effort of converting a poet into a merchant, and that, content with the independence he had realized, he would abandon his dreams of founding a dynasty of financiers. From this moment all disquietude ceased beneath this always well-meaning, though often perplexed roof, while my father, enabled amply to gratify his darling passion of book-collecting, passed his days in tranquil study and in the society of congenial spirits. His new friend introduced him almost immediately to Mr. James Pettit Andrews, a Berkshire gentleman of literary pursuits, and whose hospitable table at Brompton was the resort of the best literary society of the day. Here my father was a frequent guest, and walking home one night together from this house, where they had both dined, he made the acquaintance of a young poet which soon ripened into intimacy, and which throughout 60 years, notwithstanding many changes of life, never died away. This youthful poet had already gained laurels, though he was only 3 or 4 years older than my father, but I am not at this moment quite aware whether his brow was yet encircled with the amaranthine wreath of the pleasures of memory. Some years after this, great vicissitudes unhappily occurred in the family of Mr. Pye. He was obliged to retire from Parliament, and to sell his family estate of Faringdon. His Majesty had already, on the death of Thomas Warton, nominated him Poet Laureate, and after his retirement from Parliament, the Government which he had supported appointed him a Commissioner of Police. It was in these days that his friend Mr. Penn, of Stoke Park in Buckinghamshire, presented him with a cottage worthy of a poet on his beautiful estate; and it was thus my father became acquainted with the amiable descendant of the most successful of colonizers, and with that classic domain which the genius of Gray, as it were, now haunts, and has for ever hallowed, and from which he beheld with fond and musing eye those distant spires and antique towers that no one can now look upon without remembering him. It was amid these rambles in Stoke Park, amid the scenes of Gray's genius, the elegiac churchyard, and the picturesque fragments of the long story, talking over the deeds of great rebellion with the descendants of cavaliers and Parliament men, that my father first imbibed that feeling of the county of Buckingham, which induced him occasionally to be a dweller in its limits, and ultimately, more than a quarter of a century afterwards, to establish his household gods in its heart. And here perhaps I may be permitted to mention a circumstance which is indeed trifling, and yet, as a coincidence, not, I think, without interest. Mr. Pye was the great-grandson of Sir Robert Pye of Bradenham, who married Anne, the eldest daughter of Mr. Hampden. How little could my father dream, 60 years ago, that he would pass the last quarter of his life in the mansion house of Bradenham, that his name would become intimately connected with the county of Buckingham, and that his own remains would be interred in the vault of the chancel of Bradenham Church, among the coffins of the descendants of the Hampdens and the Pyes, all which should teach us that whatever may be our natural bent, there is a power in the disposal of events greater than human will. It was about 2 years after his first acquaintance with Mr. Pye that my father, being then in his 25th year, influenced by the circle in which he then lived, gave an anonymous volume to the press, the fate of which he could little have foreseen. The taste for literary history was then of recent date in England. It was developed by Dr. Johnson and the Wartons, who were the true founders of that elegant literature in which France had so richly preceded us. The fashion for literary anecdote prevailed at the end of the last century. Mr. Pettit Andrews, assisted by Mr. Pye and Captain Grose, and shortly afterwards his friend Mr. Seward, in his Anecdotes of Distinguished Persons, had both of them produced ingenious works which had experienced public favour. But these volumes were rather entertaining than substantial, and their interest in many instances was necessarily fleeting, all which made Mr. Rogers observe that the world was far gone in its anecdotage. While Mr. Andrews and his friend were hunting for personal details in the recollections of their contemporaries, my father maintained one day that the most interesting of miscellanies might be drawn up by a well-read man from the library in which he lived. It was objected, on the other hand, that such a work would be a mere compilation, and could not succeed, with its dead matter, in interesting the public. To test the truth of this assertion, my father occupied himself in the preparation of an octavo volume, the principal materials of which were found in the diversified collections of the French Ana. But he enriched his subjects with as much of our own literature as his reading afforded, and he conveyed the result in that lively and entertaining style which he from the first commanded. This collection of anecdotes, characters, sketches, and observations, literary, critical, and historical, as the title page of the first edition figures, he invested with the happy baptism of Curiosities of Literature. He sought by this publication neither reputation nor a coarser reward, for he published his work anonymously and avowedly as a compilation, and he not only published the work at his own expense, but in his heedlessness made a present of the copyright to the bookseller, which 3 or 4 years afterwards he was fortunate enough to purchase at a public sale. The volume was an experiment whether a taste for literature could not be infused into the multitude. Its success was so decided that its projector was tempted to add a second volume 2 years afterward, with a slight attempt at more original research. I observe that there was a second edition of both volumes in 1794. For 20 years the brother volumes remained favourites of the public. When after that long interval their writer, taking advantage of a popular title, poured forth all the riches of his matured intellect, his refined taste, and accumulated knowledge into their pages, and produced what may be fairly described as the most celebrated miscellany of modern literature. The moment that the name of the youthful author of the abusive satire had transpired, Peter Pindar, faithful to the instinct of his nature, wrote a letter of congratulation and compliment to his assailant, and desired to make his acquaintance. The invitation was responded to, and until the death of Walcot they were intimate. My father always described Walcot as a warm-hearted man, coarse in his manners and rather rough, but eager to serve those whom he liked, of which indeed I might appropriately mention an instance. It so happened that about the year 1795, when he was in his 29th year, there came over my father that mysterious illness to which the youth of men of sensibility, and especially literary men, is frequently subject, a failing of nervous energy, occasioned by study and too sedentary habits, early and habitual reverie, restless and indefinite purpose. The symptoms, physical and moral, are most distressing, lassitude and despondency. And it usually happens, as in the present instance, that the cause of suffering is not recognized, and that medical men, misled by the superficial symptoms, and not seeking to acquaint themselves with the psychology of their patients, arrive at erroneous, often fatal conclusions. In this case, the most eminent of the faculty gave it as their opinion that the disease was consumption. Dr. Turton, if I recollect right, was then the most considered physician of the day. An immediate visit to a warmer climate was his specific, and as the continent was then disturbed and foreign residence out of the question, Dr. Turton recommended that his patient should establish himself without delay in Devonshire. When my father communicated this impending change in his life to Walcot, the modern Skelton shook his head. He did not believe that his friend was in a consumption, but being a Devonshire man, and loving very much his native province, he highly approved of the remedy. He gave my father several letters of introduction to persons of consideration at Exeter, among others, one whom he justly described as a poet and a physician, and the best of men, the late Dr. Hugh Downman. Provincial cities very often enjoy a transient term of intellectual distinction. An eminent man often collects around him congenial spirits, and the power of association sometimes produces distant effects which even an individual, however gifted, could scarcely have anticipated. A combination of circumstances had made at this time Exeter a literary metropolis. A number of distinguished men flourished there at the same moment. Some of their names are even now remembered. Jackson of Exeter still survives as a native composer of original genius. He was also an author of high aesthetical speculation. The heroic poems of Hole are forgotten, but his essay on the Arabian Nights is still a cherished volume of elegant and learned criticism. Hayter was the classic antiquary who first discovered the art of unrolling the manuscripts of Herculaneum. There were many others, noisier and more bustling, who are now forgotten, though they in some degree influenced the literary opinion of their time. It was said, and I believe truly, that the two principal, if not sole, organs of periodical criticism at that time, I think the Critical Review and the Monthly Review, were principally supported by Exeter contributions. No doubt this circumstance may account for a great deal of mutual praise and sympathetic opinion on literary subjects, which, by a convenient arrangement, appeared in the pages of publications otherwise professing contrary opinions on all others. Exeter had then even a learned society, which published its Transactions. With such companions, by whom he was received with a kindness and hospitality which to the last he often dwelt on, it may easily be supposed that the banishment of my father from the delights of literary London was not as productive a source of gloom as the exile of Ovid to the savage Pontus, even if it had not been his happy fortune to have been received on terms of intimate friendship by the accomplished family of Mr. Baring, who was then member for Exeter, and beneath whose roof he passed a great portion of the period of nearly 3 years, during which he remained in Devonshire. The illness of my father was relieved, but not removed, by this change of life. Mr. Downman was his physician, whose only remedies were port wine, horse exercise, rowing on the neighbouring river, and the distraction of agreeable society. This wise physician recognized the temperament of his patient, and perceived that his physical derangement was an effect instead of a cause. My father, instead of being in a consumption, was endowed with a frame of almost superhuman strength, and which was destined for half a century of continuous labour and sedentary life. The vital principle in him, indeed, was so strong that when he left us at 82, it was only as the victim of a violent epidemic, against whose virulence he struggled with so much power that it was clear but for this casualty he might have been spared to this world even for several years. I should think that this illness of his youth, and which, though of a fitful character, was of many years' duration, arose from his inability to direct to a satisfactory end the intellectual power which he was conscious of possessing. He would mention the 10 years of his life, from 25 to 35 years of age, as a period very deficient in self-contentedness. The fact is, with a poetic temperament, he had been born in an age when the poetic faith, of which he was a votary, had fallen into decrepitude, and had become only a form with the public, not yet gifted with sufficient fervour to discover a new creed. He was a pupil of Pope and Boileau, yet both from his native impulse and from the glowing influence of Rousseau he felt the necessity and desire of infusing into the verse of the day more passion than might resound from the frigid lyre of Mr. Hayley. My father had fancy, sensibility, and an exquisite taste, but he had not that rare creative power which the blended and simultaneous influence of the individual organization and the spirit of the age, reciprocally acting upon each other, can alone perhaps perfectly develop, the absence of which at periods of transition is so universally recognized and deplored, and yet which always, when it does arrive, captivates us, as it were, by surprise. How much there was of freshness and fancy and natural pathos in his mind may be discerned in his Persian romance of the loves of Majnun and Leila, We who have been accustomed to the great poets of the 19th century, seeking their best inspiration in the climate and manners of the East, who are familiar with the land of the sun, from the Isles of Ionia to the vales of Kashmir, can scarcely appreciate the literary originality of a writer who 50 years ago dared to devise a real Eastern story, and seeking inspiration in the pages of Oriental literature, compose it with reference to the Eastern mind and customs and landscape. One must have been familiar with the Almorans and Hamets, the visions of Mirza and the kings of Ethiopia, and the other dull and monstrous masquerades of Orientalism then prevalent, to estimate such an enterprise, in which, however, one should not forget the author had the advantage of the guiding friendship of that distinguished Orientalist, Sir William Ouseley. The reception of this work by the public, and of other works of fiction which its author gave to them anonymously, was in every respect encouraging, and their success may impartially be registered as fairly proportionate to their merits. But it was not a success or a proof of power which, in my father's opinion, compensated for that life of literary research and study which their composition disturbed and enfeebled. It was at the ripe age of 35 that he renounced his dreams of being an author, and resolved to devote himself for the rest of his life to the acquisition of knowledge. When my father, many years afterwards, made the acquaintance of Sir Walter Scott, the great poet saluted him by reciting a poem of half a dozen stanzas, which my father had written in his early youth. Not altogether without agitation, surprise was expressed that these lines should have been known, still more that they should have been remembered. "Ah," said Sir Walter, "if the writer of these lines had gone on, he would have been an English poet." Footnote. Sir Walter was sincere, for he inserted the poem in the English Minstrelsy. It may now be found in these volumes, Volume 1, page 230, where, in consequence of the recollection of Sir Walter, and as illustrative of manners now obsolete, it was subsequently inserted. End of footnote. It is possible, it is even probable, that, if my father had devoted himself to the art, he might have become the author of some elegant and popular didactic poem on some ordinary subject, which his fancy would have adorned with grace, and his sensibility invested with sentiment; some small volume which might have reposed with a classic title upon our library shelves, and served as a prize volume at ladies' schools. This celebrity was not reserved for him. Instead of this, he was destined to give to his country a series of works illustrative of its literary and political history, full of new information and new views, which time and opinion has ratified as just. But the poetical temperament was not thrown away upon him. It never is on any one. It was this great gift which prevented his being a mere literary antiquary. It was this which animated his page with picture and his narrative with interesting vivacity. Above all, it was this temperament which invested him with that sympathy with his subject which made him the most delightful biographer in our language. In a word, it was because he was a poet that he was a popular writer, and made belles lettres charming to the multitude. It was during the 10 years that now occurred that he mainly acquired that store of facts which were the foundation of his future speculations. His pen was never idle, but it was to note and to register, not to compose. His researches were prosecuted every morning among the manuscripts of the British Museum, while his own ample collections permitted him to pursue his investigation in his own library into the night. The materials which he accumulated during this period are only partially exhausted. At the end of 10 years, during which, with the exception of one anonymous work, he never indulged in composition, the irresistible desire of communicating his conclusions to the world came over him, and after all his almost childish aspirations, his youth of reverie and hesitating and imperfect effort, he arrived at the mature age of 45 before his career as a great author, influencing opinion, really commenced. End of Section 2.